Hello, thank you for inviting me to come and speak with you today. I am James Olson from California. I have a fourth generation walnut grower. I have a nursery and much experience growing walnuts in California, and I'm here to share with you some techniques and technologies that I think can go well here in Moldova. I'm here with Mr. Nut Vision and the invitation here. I've seen a number of fields here in Moldova, which I thank you much for inviting me to see this. So coming from California, there are differences in the environment, the soil, the land, and also the regulatory environment in this. But there are technologies there that I think could be very beneficial to you here in Moldova to increase the production of your orchards that I'd like to share with you. With walnuts, there's kind of two ideas. I see here in Moldova you have these trees along the roads and that are not commercial. There's also this effort in recent years to establish commercially viable orchards that are going to be profitable, that are going to have a product that is sellable in the world market from a quality and quantity standpoint. And on observation, some of those initial efforts have not been as successful as desired. So I think with better planning, we can move forward and make this more successful. But you can't take the situation in California and move it here because the weather and the availability of things are different. So to have a commercially viable orchard, we have to be able to produce the nuts for less than what we can sell them. This is basic economics you would all understand. To do this, we have to look at inputs and also the quantity of nuts that are being produced per hectare. And if either one is too high, if we produce many nuts per hectare but our inputs are too high, we will not be profitable. If our production is too low, the cost per kilogram is going to be too high also. We have to look at this over an extended period of time. A walnut orchard is going to be in production. In California, I have harvested orchards 60 years old, and they're still productive because they're managed. So this is a long-term investment that must be set up well up front in addition to having plans. So if you have, say, a plan for water supply that is only going to be good for the first 4 years, this investment ultimately is not going to be successful. So I want to make sure I share with you what is going to be needed to keep the orchard in production for a long life so that the initial investment effort in development will be able to be spread over as many years as possible and increase the profits. It is important with this also that we work with nature. If we set up a system that is very oppositional to the situation area, whether with water use, whether with pests that we're controlling very harshly with chemicals, in time the system will break down. So we work with nature to have an orchard that is going to thrive in the situation it's living in, and this will give better success. In my observations of the orchards when I was touring Moldova the last few days, what I most saw is the most common mistake was basically a lack of planning in orchard layout. There was a lot of orchards that had been set up one way and then needed to be changed, and in some cases rechanged because of poor planning. So your foundation of this is to plan well before the ground is fed, before you've bought any trees, so that way the steps to success are well laid out through the time period. The first step would be to survey your resources from wherever it is. If you're looking for land, see what you need to look for to plant a walnut orchard. If you have existing land, look at the land and see, is this going to be successful in the walnut industry? We have, it says, the strategic resources we need. So water. Walnuts need a fair amount of water. There's also a fair amount of land in Moldova that the reality is it will be dry farmed. This is fine. We can dry farm walnuts here in the Moldovan climate. This would be a difference between the climate in California, where it is not feasible to dry farm walnuts. There's inadequate moisture there. But here it is. But you're going to want to lay the orchards out different. You're going to want to care for them different if you are in a dry farming situation than if you have irrigation. In all these cases, we're looking at what is the most limiting factor in that location. If it is an irrigated situation, the limiting factor should be light interception. In a dry farming situation, the limiting factor is likely to be water. So a commercial walnut orchard in California will consume somewhere in the neighborhood of 8,000 cubic meters of water per hectare per year. This is total measured consumption by satellite data. It does not mean we need to apply that much irrigation. And these orchards that have this measured have more or less 100% canopy cover. They're intercepting all the light that falls in this land. Looking at the Moldovan situation, you have somewhat lower temperatures, you have somewhat higher humidity in a lot of the year, and I have not seen any Moldovan orchards that have 100% canopy due to how they're laid out. So your use of water in the orchard is going to be lower than this, but you still need to consider how much water is needed for a producing walnut orchard. And of course, this does not include water that fell as rain. So you would take and reduce this by the amount of rain that falls on your land and then percentage of canopy. You still need substantial water to grow walnuts. This water, if we're talking about irrigation water, needs to be of high quality. In many cases, there's ways of correcting issues with groundwater, but it depends on what they are. pH issues are fairly easy to correct. Salt issues, if you have high sodium content, for instance, is not. And it may not be feasible to use this water. The cost of correcting the water is greater than the returns that would be achieved by using the water that is at such high cost to the need of correction. There's also some contaminants that can be precipitated out by running through open ditches. This would be part of the survey if you're looking into putting in a walnut orchard, is to survey, in addition to land, the situation of water. What would be needed to do this, or are we in a dry farming situation? And in which case, what is our rainfall patterns in the specific location you are? And it needs to be sure that this water is going to be available in the long term. If we're talking about irrigation in particular, this is a current issue we will get into later with California, where there's been changes in the rules of availability of water. And that is one of the reasons why the production in California is dropping and is likely to drop the next few years. But for your sakes, be sure you look into this before planting, before spending a large amount of money to establish irrigation. Is the water supply going to be consistently available for a period of many decades? Because remember, we're talking about an investment that, if all goes well, should be in the ground for at least 30 years and possibly up to 60 years. We need to next look at the soil. So my observation of Moldova is you are blessed with amazingly deep and fertile soils here. That is one of the major resources of your country. But you still have to look at the specific situation. In this field where you're looking to plant walnuts, what is the drainage? Walnuts need a deep, well-drained soil to thrive. They are going to need a variety of nutrients. So if you have ground that has been in some previous crop that is very depleted of certain nutrients, it might be a great place for a plantation, but you will need to have factored into your cost what will be needed to supplement these nutrients that are not there, and take action. Some of these things, especially structural issues, are much easier to deal with before the orchard's planted. If you have plow pans, if you have any sort of clay layers, those can be broken up before the orchard's planted. Once the orchard's in place, there's very little that can be done to change the situation with these sort of issues. Soil pH is another thing you should be aware of. Ideally, walnuts want somewhere between 6.5 and 8 on the pH, and they really do better between about 6.5 and 7.2, 7.1, somewhere in there. Beware of deep free lime. I do not know in Moldova if you have this, but it's an issue in other places I have dealt with. If you have free lime that's meter and a half deep, what can happen, even if the topsoil is good, is the tree will do very well until the roots get into this deep free lime, and then it can kill the tree. I've had this happen. So before you're planting a place, get a soil auger and go bore into the ground and make sure there isn't a deep issue that is going to cause you troubles some years down the road. Well drained, we mentioned. One other issue that I have not heard of here in Moldova, but I have in others, is boron toxicity. Walnuts are fairly susceptible to excess levels of boron in the soil, and this is something to check in your water also. If you have high levels of boron, you need to make sure they aren't going to be excessive for the walnut plantings, because it can cause detrimental effects on your trees. And then biological activity of the soil is also very important. This is something, the initial orchard establishment tends to disrupt biological activity, but we want to establish good activity in the ground once it is planted, so we can improve our nutrient availability and our effectiveness of fertilizer use. pH levels, organic matter, are both adjustable and in many cases can be put in this. Mycorrhizal fungi most easily is put on right at planting. You can treat the roots as an inoculum, and then it will thrive in the soil, provided that the soil is set up to support a colony of mycorrhizal fungi, which greatly increases the effectiveness and area of the root surface. And if you have established orchards and want to establish mycorrhizal fungi, the best way to do this is by inoculation of seed that you plant as some sort of a cover crop in the middles, and this will establish the mycorrhizal fungi into the soil, where it can then persist for many decades. Cover crops is something that I think could be very much looked into here in Moldova. In California, they are very widely used and very effective. Our climate there is different, so we need, if I shared with you the details of what we're growing in California, it will not work here in Moldova. But I have seen similar climates to this that have made effective use of cover crops to deal with soil penetration issues, deal with nutrients. In addition to the legumes, which, as you probably all know, can fix nitrogen, there are abilities of growing different forbs that can extract and make available potassium, selenium, and different micronutrients from the soil, and as they break down, it's available. This is something I think more research into this climate can be done. If it is effectively done, it can greatly reduce the demand for chemical fertilizers and inputs. For example, in California, I am able to grow walnuts that produce very well in the order of 7 or 8 tons per hectare, metric tons per hectare, with effectively no nitrogen inputs by cover crops, no synthetic nitrogen inputs, by using cover crops and using composted manure, which is widely available in the area I'm from due to a large dairy industry. Obviously, this is a huge cost saving compared to needing to purchase synthetic inputs for all of these factors. So once we've done our research, we have our water supply, or we've decided to dry farm, and we have our soil looked into, we want to set up the field to plant. In most cases here in Moldova, I see you planting on rolling fields, which is terrific. If you have something that, if you found any issues with the soil structure that would be looked into, this can be corrected before planting by subsoiling. If you have plow pans, if you have hard pans, clay pans, large shanks can break these up before the trees go in the ground. Determine spacing of your orchards. One thing I've noticed here in Moldova, your spacings are very wide and you have fairly small trees. You're largely growing Chandler, which is not very vigorous, on Regia rootstock. You can greatly increase the light interception, in particular in an irrigated chase, by tightening your spacings. The common spacings in California range from 6 to 7 meter aisles and 3 to 7 meters down the row, with the most common spacing, it's in feet, but roughly converted in meters, of about 7 by 7. And another factor in California that I think could easily be adopted in any new plantings here in Moldova is by offsetting. So instead of laying the field out in a grid where the rows all line up in both directions, If you have your aisles free and then offset the trees down the row, that gives each tree greater light interception, or in a dry farm situation, greater area that it can pull water in before it starts interfering with the neighboring trees, and can increase the efficiency of the orchard over a long period of time. The more vigorous the rootstock and variety, the stronger the grounds, the wider the spacing. I would put somewhere by 7 meters as an outside large spacing. I have fields as narrow as 6 meters by 3 meters. Roughly it's in feet, so it comes out to decimals, that are 30 years old and highly productive. So this is something that could easily be considered. For weaker ground, less serious trees placed together, if you have a drainage issue, there was someone I was talking to that had a field that was very flat and would fill with water in the winter and was getting root diseases. Planting on berms or borders, which are, as exemplified in the picture, can be highly helpful to this. In many cases, these root diseases will infect outstanding roots away from the trunk of the tree, but the tree is more able to fight them there. Whereas if the base of the tree right at the, I don't think the pointer's working. Can't see the pointer. If the base of the tree right where the comes out of the ground gets infected with root diseases, this is probably going to be fatal to the tree. So that is a factor to look at if you are in an area that is all prone to standing water, because when walnuts are dormant, they're quite tolerant of standing water, but once they have started to leaf out in the spring, they are not at all. And this is something that could very much destroy your investment in the productivity of the orchard if you get standing water against the base of the tree and get infestation with root diseases. But it's easily avoided by planting on a berm if you are in a situation that has possibility of this. Irrigation system and design. There are numerous designs of irrigation systems, but the main factor is they need to be able to apply the amount of water that the orchard needs or that you have available if you are looking at a limited irrigation or a dry farming situation. So typically we have double line drip, single line drip, fan jets. They all have their different advantages. In most cases, I would recommend drip irrigation on the situation here in Moldova. Fan jets are widely used in California. There are two reasons they're used widely in California. One is we are extremely hot and dry, and you can lower the temperature of the entire orchard by turning the fan jets on and using evaporative cooling, provided you have adequate water. Here in Moldova, this is not a common situation, so not really a factor. The one thing to watch if you do decide to use fan jets is you do not want the water hitting the base of the trunk of the tree, because this can cause disease issues on the tree if it stays wet. We in fact size irrigation systems by evapotranspiration rate. So in Moldova you'd have, describe this well, you want to engineer your irrigation system because it is possible. Remember, we looked at walnuts, fully producing irrigated walnuts in California are using somewhere in the neighborhood of 8,000 cubic meters per hectare. If you go, okay, we're going to do this, we're going to irrigate, we need to meet these water requirements, but the system is not able to put this out, then you will never meet the potential of that. If you have limited water, that is also useful, but don't pinch yourself by engineering the system poorly. You should be able to take maximum usage of the resources you have, and if you have water availability to meet evapotranspiration rates, size the system to do this so that you don't find yourself limited by an engineering decision as opposed to an inherent limitation of resources where you are. So dripper spacing is largely a factor of soil texture. The higher the clay content, the better the soil subs water, the further apart you can put your drippers. Sand your soil once them closer together. This is also a difference between single line drip, double line drip. Single line drip is less expensive, can work fine, provided you're meeting your evapotranspiration rates. However, you need soil that can sub water well, or you will have limited root development only where the drippers sit. Fan jets have a wide area, but they have higher evaporation losses. here would be disadvantaged. In California, they're used partly for this as a cooling mechanism. And there is various systems of automating these micro-irrigation systems. Can be helpful for labor use. You still have to check your system because animals chew on them, the wind blows them, things of this nature, but it can reduce the need to go around and change water levels. And there's opportunities to use fertilizer applications through irrigation systems if the system is set up properly and has even enough distribution that you can also distribute fertilizers with that. I've seen here in Moldova quite a bit of dry farming walnuts. It is very good here in Moldova. You have areas with adequate rain and water to do that. This has lower costs and lower production. It can be just as profitable, and probably. One thing that you would want to take into consideration in a dry farm situation is the limiting factor should be water. So you want to look at any other limiting factors on your trees and correct those so that you're able to use maximum use of every bit of water that falls on your ground. One way I do this is dry farming. I would space the trees out somewhat further. I have discussion a little bit on varieties. Largely here in Moldova, you're using some French varieties and you're using Chandler. None of these varieties are exceptionally vigorous in their growth or especially able to deal with drought conditions. The Chandler was chosen in California due to its nut quality, which is consistent. And this is a wonderful thing. I have no objections to growing Chandlers here or anywhere else. If you are very short on water, I would suggest looking into Sur and Tulare. These are much more vigorous varieties that I think I would not go plant hundreds of hectares, but put a test in and see. They may respond very well to your conditions here in Moldova with dry farming due to the greater plant vigor and also pollination, which we'll get into further later. I would also space my dry farming trees somewhat further apart so they have a greater area to pull moisture from. So plants. The plants are your players in this field. You have to get as many and the highest quality plants as the land will support. We want the right rootstock for the soil conditions. Almost everything here is on Regia, which is a fine rootstock. You have no compatibility issues. It also means that you have no concern about a disease called blackline that can be a problem in areas with Hinsi-based rootstocks. The Hinsi-based rootstocks, which are common in California, are much more vigorous. So that is a factor. The right variety. Like I say, largely you're growing Chandlers. There are these other varieties that have greater vigor and have high potential in the US. They're widely grown in California. Pollinators. This is another factor that is interesting here in Moldova. In walnuts in California and Chile are largely grown in districts where you have grow after grow that are all together, so there's a very high pollen level in the greater area. Here you don't have that, so you must use pollinators because you cannot rely on this general pollen in the area. Having the right pollinators and spacing is important. Generally, we'll put like every fifth tree, every fifth row, we'll have pollinators. You want to make sure you mark the pollinators. If you are selling into a high quality market, you need to keep the nuts separated because they will shell different, they sell at different levels. And you want to overlap in the bloom timing. So walnuts have a male flower and a female flower that come out at different times. If this overlap between your pollinators or the tree itself does not match, you will have poor production. And start with good plants. There's a challenge throughout the world with the quality of nursery stock that is available. The highest quality plants you can find are what you want, because this can cause many issues down the road. If you ended up ordering one variety, it turns out it's something else, or if the trees come diseased or undersized. And what we have seen here and in other areas outside these big districts is, in many cases, the number one issue with production in orchards that should be going into production well is lack of pollen due to pollinator choices. Here are some thoughts on varieties and pollinators. So in addition to the Chandler, which you're familiar with, and the French varieties, I think it would be very useful to try some Tulare and Sur varieties. The Tulare is a variety that has the highest production of any varieties out of California. It is somewhat earlier than the Chandler. The other advantage of having these varieties is you can spread out your harvest. The Chandlers, say in Moldova, are all going to come ripe within about a 2-week period, which makes great pressure on trying to get them harvested in a timely fashion. If you can spread out to other varieties, this will spread your harvest over a greater time period. For instance, if we started with Sur and then Tulare and then Chandler, you would have somewhere close to 2 months to get off your crop, which would greatly increase the ability to use processing equipment, harvest equipment, or the labor force if you're harvesting by hand. Pollinators, the first 3 on the top there are likely pollinators for Chandler. I would suggest in your pollinator spacing to have more than 1 pollinator and keep track of which ones are which. So you have some Franquettes in your field, and you have some Vernettes or some Avators. That way, if in any given year the timing of the one variety is not matching well Chandler, you still have pollen available. The Tehama I mentioned, but I do not recommend. The Tehama is the traditional pollinator for the Sur variety. The problem with the Sur variety, which has never been known outside California because you don't have so much pollen, is it will over-pollinate and have this issue called pistillate bud abscission. So if someone tells you you need to put a bunch of Tehamas next to your Sur trees, I do not advise this. This can cause a problem, but I wanted to mention it because I had also mentioned the Sur variety. So you have your land laid out, you have your water system laid out, you got your trees in. How are we wanting to do this? We want to prefer to plant these trees when they're dormant because they are more resistant to the shock of planting. We want to plant fairly high in the ground. If you plant a tree in a hole and the hole fills with water, it will become diseased, it can die. So if you plant the tree high, it will root better. You want to not compact the ground. Don't plant in the mud. If the planting people, you want to make sure they don't stomp on the trees because this will, in addition, pack the ground, hurt the tree roots, can cause disease issues. Wait for the weather to cooperate. If it pours rain for a month, you are much better off waiting, even if the trees are no longer dormant, than planting in extreme wetness. Once the tree is in the ground, we didn't stomp it in, take and water, and even if you're dry farming, go get a tank and a tractor and water in the tree. The main purpose of this is to collapse any air pockets around the roots, which the trees don't like having air pockets in their roots. You want to make sure they have root soil in contact with all the root system. And the best way of doing this is by watering in. We will use pumps with the steel pipe on the end of a hose so we can basically inject water into the hole that was dug by the tree, and this causes full compaction. Because sometimes if you just put water on top of the ground around the tree, it will not fully collapse the ground around the roots. But by probing in with being able to inject water under the ground around the tree, this has more effective ability to collapse any air pockets. And then this water will be all that tree needs for the initial growth. Whether you're irrigated or not, you don't want to overwater once planting because the tree does not use a lot as it's first establishing its roots and then sprouting. So this is a very important step in planting. And then mark your pollinator varieties, as we discussed earlier. In the first year after planting, the main goal is to grow a vertical shoot up high enough that we have a trunk that is going to be able to be mechanically shook once the tree comes into production. My preference is to use a bamboo stake. I see many other stakes being used, they all work. The advantage of bamboo is it's fairly flexible, but it's still strong. So they found that with trees, if they are rigidly held, they will not increase the girth of their trunk as quickly as if they can move with the wind. So you want to make sure your tree doesn't break off, but you want to allow it to move because it will more quickly gain girth and gain strength. You'll want to remove any low shoots. This is most easily done right after they start to push buds because you can simply wipe them off. If you let them get bigger, you have to cut them, and the tree has put more energy into growing this shoot that's not in a good place. So there's a fair amount of somewhat skilled labor on the first couple years of establishing a walnut orchard. And then we want to make sure that the trees don't sunburn. If it's very hot, painting the trunk is an effective method of keeping the sun from damaging the tree trunks. And keep the weed competition right around the base of the tree low. Once a tree is large and established, it is fairly able to compete with most annual growth, but the very young trees are not. They do not have the height or the vigor to do that. And then provide for your trees nutritional needs. We have composted manure, if it is available, works very well. I know that you do not have a large livestock industry. It is often not available. I've also had very good results with this 15 type fertilizer. There was a test done in California with a bunch of specialized blends of fertilizer for young plants, and 15 actually ended up out-competing these specialized blends. And text for correct any deficiencies of micronutrients. In some cases, you can have, say, zinc or molybdenum or some minor nutrients that is low and is a limiting factor on the tree's growth. And these nutrients, because they are needed in such small amounts, are fairly inexpensive to correct as a deficiency, but you generally cannot tell unless they're extreme by looking at the tree. So once the plant has started to grow, take a tissue sample, take a leaf sample, and if you have a deficiency of something, correct it. The goal after you plant a tree is to get it in production as quickly as possible, because you have this time period when your land's tied up with the planting, but it's not producing. The more you can shorten that period of time, the sooner you can get a return on your investment in this orchard. In the dry farming conditions, the total volume of nutrients is going to be less. You have less tree growth, you have water as a limiting factor, but it is very important. It's probably more important the efficiency and timing of them. With growth in particular, walnut trees have basically one push of root growth and one push of shoot growth each year. The root flush tends to happen a little bit before and kind of overlapping with bud break in the spring. And so if the tree is going to take up nutrients, that's when it is most able to do so. And then it has a big push of vegetative growth shortly thereafter. Young trees will continue to grow throughout the growing season, but if you have a tree that's very deficient, if it misses that initial flush of growth, it is not going to ever achieve as much growth in that season as it could. The rest of the early years were, there we go. So early years I put anywhere between, so we have year one, we have trees established until we start harvesting the trees, which I tend to move into care of producing orchards. The main importance, we want to keep this tree growing and we want to structure the tree well. So pruning is a major factor. The most efficient from light interception standpoint is a tree with a central leader, and we want to avoid heading cuts in most cases because those cause splits and cause the tree to shade itself more than if we can avoid those. And we want to make sure we structure the tree so we can achieve mechanical harvest. To have a fast harvest, an efficient harvest that produces a high quality product, we have to be able to harvest mechanically, and the tree needs to be structured so it can be shaken well so that the equipment can get through the orchard to do that. In most cases, I want to avoid tillage. We've broken the ground up a great deal in planting. We'll need to get the ground smooth enough that the harvest equipment can run. Typically after that, I'm only going to need to rework the ground every 8 to 12 years as it gets rough. But to do this, minimization of tillage, which is very effective for keeping your mycorrhizal happy, keeping your soil structure well, we have to make sure we don't go in the ground when it's too wet and cause tracks. We need to avoid basically making the ground too rough. Limited root development. It's all coming up. So this would be specific for irrigated orchards. The best way of figuring out how much to water your orchard is by pressure chamber. You want to look at the stem potential. This measures how much water stress is in the tree, and then watering to match this. You will learn too how fast the trees dry out, how much they're using based on climate, based on your soil conditions, the water holding capacity of your soil. The soil moisture probes can be useful. Having a weather station is useful. If you have a weather station, in a lot of cases you can see what the evapotranspiration rate of your orchard is. You can do pressure bomb testing periodically and then compare it to ET data. and water to ET data. And then soil augers are very useful as well, both for, we talked about earlier, seeing any underlying issues, testing any problem issues, and there is a art of feeling soil to determine the moisture level of it that is commonly useful. The machine on the right is a pressure chamber showing how to use it. There's a manual pump system. We have some examples of soil augers there at the bottom. So weed management we discussed in brief, but to make more clear, we need to make sure we don't have severe competition of weeds with young plants. The pre-emergent herbicides tend to be most effective. These are applied in winter to spring. They have to be applied shortly before a rainfall event to be effective, to lock them in the soil. And we want to make sure we don't have herbicide on our young trees, so you cover the base of the trees if you're using sprayed-on herbicides so that it doesn't get into the plant. There's also methods of mulching and grazing that have been used and can work well to control annual weed growth there and around plants, both young and old. And that is a brief discussion on development of young orchards. And I have another discussion on California walnut industry to share with you. Yes, please, I have one right there. Yeah. Thank you. So we'll go through introductions somewhat quickly since I just introduced myself for the last talk. This one will be on the California walnut industry, so you have some idea of how it is structured and perhaps how Moldova can set up an industry to support the growers and the sales of the walnuts. And I want to perhaps emphasize the whole part of this talk is that I'm growing walnuts in California as part of a well-established industry. As Murat shared earlier, there's been a commercial industry in California for something on the order of 150 years. And so that gives a support and institutional knowledge that I'm here to try to share with you, but doesn't exist at the moment here in Moldova. The different parts of this industry, we have the growers who are producing the walnuts. There's a processor system that gets the walnuts from the grower that then turns them into retailable products. The handlers that do the final sales. There's a research branch of UC Davis out of the university that has most of the technical knowledge of walnuts worldwide. It has some roots there. There's a nursery system, and then there's various governing bodies that support the industry in the state. In the United States, more or less all the walnuts in the whole country are grown in California. It's about 4,500 walnut growers. They are required to sell to registered handlers. There's about 80 handlers registered currently. And these handlers process, calibrate, pack, shell the nuts, and then sell them into the world market. Most of them sell largely through brokers. They also, in many cases, have retail markets. I myself am a registered handler and have a retail sales business in California. We have these various governing bodies. And these governing bodies do a variety of things. Probably the most important, and some of the first that was set up, was they established some universal quality standards for nuts that come out of California, where you can sell any quality of nuts from California, but they have labels. So say if I go to the market and I buy light halves and pieces 20%, I can be confident that these nuts will have a certain grade, as far as defects, as far as half count, as far as color. And this is something that I think could be very beneficial to Moldova as a volunteer organization, however you structured it as an industry. I'm not here to tell you how to run that, but to have some sort of established quality standards. So if someone comes to Moldova to buy walnuts and you put a label on it that says these are 32 gauge and meet this quality standard, there is confidence that this will do that. These industry organizations also have funded a great deal of the breeding research, pruning research, light interception data. Many of the things I share with you are based on research initially funded by these organizations over a long period of time. We're talking over 100 years. There's the Walnut Board, promotes largely domestic sales within the United States of California walnuts, and it runs this breeding program. If you are growing Chandlers, you are benefiting from this breeding program. And have the standardized grades. The Walnut Commission, there was a legal structure issue as exports became more important to California, where the Walnut Board was not able to fund marketing in other countries, and it was easier to establish another organization than to try to modify the bylaws of the board to allow this. So the Walnut Commission existed to fund advertising in foreign countries. A lot of this went into Asia and Europe. So European market you're familiar with. Japan and Korea are also extremely important markets to California. They would not logically be a good fit for Moldova due to shipping distances. But shipping off the west coast of California to Asia is a fairly direct boat trip. And the Walnut Alliance, there's been some conflict in the California walnut industry between the processors and the Walnut Board and the Commission and the growers. You have a 100-year-old organization, it tends to get set in its ways, and this Walnut Alliance has been set up to try to remedy some of the lack of transparency that the growers feel with the Walnut Board and Walnut Commission. This is something I could encourage you here in Moldova to learn from and make sure that any organization is transparent to the growers of what it's involved with. There's also this general institutional knowledge and support structure where you have a great deal of the nut equipment in the world is produced in California, so the manufacturers are there. There's also this professional organizations of the pest control advisors and certified crop advisors that specialize in certain aspects of growing. The pest control advisors in pests and their management with chemicals, and you're actually required legally to work with one of those if you're applying any sort of controlled pesticides or herbicides. Certified crop advisors, you have certification to advise on crops, and there's technical support and maintenance specialists outside of the manufacturers. So these are the things to be aware of that are needed to operate in this, and you'll have to find a way of providing these needs internally here in Moldova. Hope you found this background helpful. Thank you for your time and attention.